Social Security, will it become an issue in the 2020 election? It should be, because it's something a lot of people feel strongly about. And as you may remember, in 2016, Donald Trump was the only Republican presidential candidate on a stage of a dozen or so who said that he would not cut Social Security, something that allowed him to break free from the pack early on, although, of course, the enormous press coverage and theatrics around his campaign and the extremism also helped quite a bit. But we've also seen on the Democratic side of the aisle a lot of jockeying, political jockeying around this issue over the last 20 years or so. Here to talk about that and perhaps other issues as well is Helaine Olen. Helaine has been on the program before. We're always delighted to have her. She is an opinion writer for the Washington Post. She's written on the subject recently. So first of all, Helaine, thanks for coming back on the program.
Oh, thank you for having me on.
So always a pleasure. Now, Joe Biden. So Joe Biden, considered in many ways the leading candidate right now, although no votes have been cast for the Democratic nomination, has come out for a form of Social Security expansion. He wrote about that. That's a nice thing. But Bernie Sanders says Biden is vulnerable on this issue. Is he?
I think so. I want to backtrack a tiny bit and start at the beginning. One of the things I have found relentlessly over the years is how many Washington insiders tend to underestimate the issue of Social Security in the presidential election. This is something I actually learned very early in. I started, in newspapers before the internet was a thing for newspapers, and I remember the first blast of angry letters I ever got was "Take a wild guess, Social Security." Right? I wrote a piece about a thing called notch babies, which we don't have to discuss right now, and I got, bags full of angry emails. Bags full of angry letters, right? There's no email. Right. Actually, there might have been, but not for the sort of people who were commenting on Social Security, believe me. And anyways, this was a very early lesson in Social Security and how much it means to people. And I have said repeatedly over the years that I think one of the reasons Donald Trump pulled ahead so quickly and so early in the 2016 Republican primary was over the issue of Social Security as well. And I think this is often underestimated in his other various bigoted appeals and outsider appeals. So I just want to put that out there.
And for
the longest time, the consensus in Washington, as we all know, was that Social Security was this kind of out of control program, that it was being used by people who didn't always need it. I think we all know the stereotypical greedy geezer thing, I'm in Florida spending my children's inheritance bumper stickers. And in fact, it is a huge part of the federal budget. There's no question about this. However, what we also know is that minus Social Security, a majority of seniors would be living in poverty or near poverty without it. For all that we think seniors are really well off as a group, it's almost impossible to really save up enough for your retirement. So that's sort of the background to all of this.
And I want to add, Helaine, a couple things to your background, which I really appreciate. One is that George W. Bush, as president, wanted to privatize and go after Social Security. Democrats beat him back on that. 2006, Democrats were trusted more than Republicans by 25%, according to polling on the issue of Social Security. They won back Congress. Barack Obama appointed a deficit commission in 2010 that had, as part of its mission to quote unquote, cut or whatever, manage Social Security. By the end of 2010, Democrats' edge on this issue was entirely gone. They had lost the 25-point trust lead on Social Security, and in fact, they lost Congress that year. So it is, just to underscore your point, politically an enormously powerful force. I think there's no denying that, right?
Right. What happens is people, and this is true for people from both parties, they get to Washington and they start buying into the consensus. And the consensus is, of course, is that Social Security is a problem that needs to be tamed. And this brings me the conversation segue, right, to former Vice President Biden, who had a decades-long track record, as it turns out, of sort of moaning and groaning about Social Security, as far back as the 1980s, attempting to freeze the cost of living formula so that it wouldn't adjust with the cost of living, as a temporary freeze. Various complaints about who's getting benefits from it, and whether people who are upper income should be receiving benefits. That was in 2018. He claims he was joking. Other people have listened to the tape and said he wasn't. I would leave it up to viewers to decide whether they think he's joking or not. I would say part of it sounded like he was being sarcastic and part of it sounded like he wasn't. I'll split the difference with everybody. So, but this is a huge, huge issue. And there's lots of videotape out there. And Bernie Sanders' chief speechwriter, Dave Sirota, has been having a yeoman's time on Twitter, releasing all of this videotape over the past week or two, just sort of dumping it online. And one of my contentions is if you don't think this is going to be coming to a Facebook ad near you in the fall of 2020, I'm misstating my year, sorry about that, the fall of 2020, if Biden is the nominee, you're very, very wrong. And the best part of this, of course, is that most political reporters under the age of 50 or 55, unless they actually go into Facebook and look it up, probably won't know it, because it certainly, with micro-targeting, won't be going to them.
Right. And that itself is a fascinating issue, because it used to be, if Lyndon Johnson ran an ad, which he did in 1964, of a nuclear bomb going off and blowing up a little girl picking daisies, everybody knew, right? Because, it was on network TV. But if Donald Trump runs a bunch of targeted ads, this is assuming Joe Biden is the nominee, of course, of this kind on Facebook, there's really no way to know, which is fascinating and important. Now, of course, to get there, Biden will have to win the nomination. So I guess the other question, I don't know what your thoughts are on this, is Social Security going to be an issue in the Democratic primary?
Well, it should be. Certainly if Bernie Sanders has his way, it will be. And certainly if Elizabeth Warren has her way, it will be. Sanders introduced a plan last year that would, boost the rates the amounts getting paid by lower income people, and changing the cost of living adjustment to reflect the fact that older people actually experience higher inflation than younger people because of pharmaceuticals, mostly healthcare, pharmaceuticals, and housing. Elizabeth Warren has also introduced a plan to, buttress not introduced, but, a plan in her campaign to buttress Social Security. And finally, I should say, Biden has also introduced a plan to increase Social Security. The difference being, of course, that Sanders has a, decades-long track record of supporting Social Security. And there's no videotape of him floating around saying this beast needs to be tamed. Because one of the things is, to go back to what you were saying for a moment, when Social Security came up in 2010 with the Republican, Democrat-Republican bipartisan commission. Biden's the guy who was supposedly responsible for the appointment of Alan Simpson to that commission, who is a real hater of Social Security. Really wants to see it trimmed back, and once famously described it as, I believe, something along the lines of a cow udder with 300 teats.
A milk cow with 310 million teats was the exact quote. Yeah.
Right. And I just want to point out that this is actually, whether this was a Freudian slip or not, is not for me to say, but this is really like an on-point criticism if you're against it, because actually the majority of Social Security recipients are female over the age of 62. They are more dependent on it to stay out of poverty. And certainly by the time they are 85, 90, they are more than 2/3 of recipients, because women tend to outlive men. So in a weird way, this is, when you're advocating Social Security trims, you're actually sort of advocating, tossing grandma or mom from the train. This is not how people traditionally think about it, but I've always said Social Security, among other things, is one of the great unknown feminist issues of our time.
Well, I couldn't agree with you more, number one. And again, we're talking with Helaine Olen, opinion writer for the Washington Post, Number two, Alan Simpson also popularized and continually used the phrase you mentioned earlier of greedy geezers. And I think it is important to point out that, and I've been meaning to write about this too, but there's recent studies showing that inequality among seniors has increased. So when you see all those figures about, seniors have this wealth and seniors have this income, well, not most seniors. The top 20% are doing great, but there are a lot of seniors, as you say, majority, being kept out of poverty by Social Security. Social Security is ungenerous by the standard of other developed countries. It's not a big benefit or anything. It should be expanded. Now, I will confess, Helaine Olen, that I have not read Joe Biden's expansion plan. I've read Bernie's, I've read others. I know that Elizabeth Warren sponsored an amendment in principle a couple years back on expanding Social Security. But is it good? Biden's plan, whether or not we believe he'll stick with it, and whatever we think about this video hurting him politically if he's the nominee, is it a decent plan?
It's certainly a decent plan. Under the proposal, people who work for 3 decades, which is most people, right, would receive a minimum benefit of 125% above the poverty line, which is not true right now necessarily. People would receive a bigger benefit after 20 years, and also people who've lost a spouse would get a bigger benefit, which is a huge actual improvement because right now people who lose a spouse actually can suffer a major financial loss as a result of how Social Security is calculated. So in and of itself, it's actually an okay plan. The issue is do you, is he going to, his past going to come back on him on this one? Is his past as a deficit hawk, basically? And I want to bring something back full circle to what you just said, which is the idea of inequality with retirement income. And this is sort of the context of the controversial remarks he made at Brookings in 2018, where he said he was being sarcastic and other people don't think he was, which is he was talking about making sure that people, can you stop for 1 second? I probably need to get rid of this. Hold on. Was talking about Joe Biden was talking about potentially means testing Social Security benefits. And if you take this seriously, this is a major issue. This is something that has been proposed time and time again. The reason you don't do it isn't because we're petrified that somebody who's very wealthy will end up with no money. We don't do it because in this country, we don't have a real great history of supporting anything that is not a universal benefit. So sort of trying to undercut it and take it so that, the wealthiest do not receive Social Security is actually a way of really starting to make it real knocks at the program and sort of turning it into a form of welfare. That's not really a fair analogy because, of course, people have paid into it, but it is how a program I can trust me that not everybody will be eligible for will be perceived if it comes to pass.
Yeah, and there are a couple points on that, Helaine Olen. Number one is, first of all, if you start down that road of means testing, they find a Concord Coalition, which is one of the, I guess, Pete Peterson, another guy who was like an architect of deficit hawkism and against Social Security. You start down that road, you find, their reports say, people with $46,000 in average income, you could start to trim the meat very quickly rather than the fat in any program if you perceive it as fat, one. Number two, if you're really concerned about rich people getting a free ride off Social Security, then tax them more. I mean, that's the logical, that's the...
Not to interrupt you, but this is exactly part of Bernie Sanders' plan. Bernie Sanders' plan, and I should say, if my understanding of Biden's plan is that it really doesn't totally describe how he's planning to fund all of this. And I might be wrong about that because I'm not an expert on this, so on that part of it. But Bernie Sanders' plan most certainly came with sort of a congressional seal of approval for his plan and his financing of it. He would do essentially would end the payroll tax cap above $250,000. Payroll tax cap right now is somewhere around 130, a little bit more than 130,000 right now. That is the point at which you don't pay taxes on your income for Social Security. And he would end it at 250,000, so there'd be a gap between the two. And he would include something that is not included in that number right now, which is dividends and capital gains. So as a result, his plan, the Social Security Administration's Office of the Chief Actuary has said that his plan would actually stabilize the program's finances for the next half century. This is a major thing because right now, Social Security, the trust fund is expected to run out in sometime in the 2030s. And when that happens, if nothing else is done, and if the government doesn't agree to deficit spending, these are all two big ifs, mind you, the Social Security would have to pay out less. The idea, just for the record, that Social Security is going bankrupt and you won't get a dime is absolutely, completely untrue and one of the great myths out there.
Yeah, no, I always say about going bankrupt that, if I have $1,000 in the bank and I'm making $1,000 a week, and then I spend $1,000 and I'm making $900 a week, I'm not bankrupt. I'm just not as well off as I was before. So, but at the other, just to close the loop on means testing, it's expensive and complicated to means test. Two, you're building this machinery that doesn't exist. And Social Security is a form of social insurance. I pay auto insurance, and if I have an accident, they don't means test. They fix the car. I mean, so there are a million ways to go at the means testing piece of it. But meanwhile, over here is, and I'm gesturing to my right, is what as far out as my arm will extend, is Donald Trump with his Republican Party, and they're going after, for all of his rhetoric, they're going after disability benefits, and Trump isn't the only one. He's got this draconian thing that making it tougher to stay on disability benefits, which is brutal towards disabled people, which Ronald Reagan did. We've got and Charles Grassley and some of the other Republican senators have witch hunted people on disability benefits and so on. But it would be a bitter irony, and not in the Alanis Morris sense, in the actual sense of the word irony, it would be a bitterly ironic if Trump was a beneficiary of all this. Wouldn't it?
Right. And I should say, a lot of people, and I put myself in this camp, think Trump is being a total con man here. From 2016 onward, people surrounding him kept saying Trump doesn't really believe this. He's going to cut Social Security. At a certain point, when your head of your campaign says this, you might want to pay attention. So I wouldn't think Social Security is safe at all, by the way. The difference is we don't have a huge mounds of tape of him saying, I want to cut Social Security floating around. And the second is he is a practiced con man and sounds believable when he says things. This is an ongoing issue with Donald Trump, as you and I both know, and as everybody listening to this show knows. The man will say anything and then do something else the next day. Witness the disability insurance, which is a cut is a cut for people mostly a lot of people, I should say, not mostly, in late middle age. People over the age of 50, 55 lose a job. If they worked in physical manual labor, it's very hard for them to get, another one necessarily, because at a certain point your body gives out. One of the things that Trump is proposing to do in here is make this, proving this and the age at which it is accepted that you can't learn new skills older. So that's a part of this. And that's going to hurt, by the way, Trump supporters, because Trump supporters tend to be disproportionately middle-aged and older.
Yes, no, that's a great point, except that he's going to tell them the Democrats did it and they'll believe it. Some of them. Well, anyway. Now, before I let you go, Helaine, Olen, there was one other thing I wanted to talk to you about, because I really appreciated you doing this in the Washington Post, opinion, money for war, but not for the poor. Whenever we talk about the fact that, we have a seemingly unlimited war budget, nobody has to justify their spending there. It's like people treat you, especially in Washington, D.C., like you're a hippie. Oh, man, peace and love. But the fact is, as the great labor politician Anthony Wedgwood Benn said in the United Kingdom once, no general ever said, I'd like to bomb Baghdad tomorrow, but I don't have the budget for it. So what is going on that, it's considered hippie-ish to point out that we spend billions, trillions of dollars on dubious wars that don't seem to keep anybody safer, while we have people dying here at home every day of the consequences of poverty and inadequate health care and a million other things, and oh well, we can't afford to do anything about it.
Right, and I actually think it's a slightly bigger issue. It's always interesting to me, and you see it when you watch any political debate, that things that benefit Americans directly, when you think of social welfare spending, are immediately subject to how are you going to pay for this? But somehow war and a few other items, but mostly war in the military, are somehow considered offline budget, right? And in one sense, that makes sense because I mean, if you can't physically protect your country, you're not doing anything else. But obviously, our military budget goes way beyond that issue. And still, somehow, it's never questioned how much money is being put towards it. Intriguingly, Donald Trump, to link the themes of the two segments here, campaigned saying, that the defense spending was out of control. This needed to be brought down. And of course, what has he done? He's approved budgets that increase military spending, and he's done this repeatedly. You might also want to make the argument that defense budget goes beyond the military and goes into the fact that we live in a country where the infrastructure is literally falling apart around us. It's been getting D ratings from various engineering societies for years now. The opioid epidemic has been devastating. Our lifespan is falling. Suicide is the second leading cause of death for Americans, ages 10 to 24. 17% of children live in poverty. You can go on and on. I mean, clearly there is something wrong with many of our lives. And I think this is fairly obvious. I mean, we have a, quote, good economy, and yet somehow everybody is walking around furious, stressed out, convinced they're about to be destitute tomorrow. And I think there are reasons for that. I don't think people are imagining it. And I think that gets to the sort of heart of it, which is that we don't take care of ourselves. As a wellness person might say. We prioritize the military and we've just kind of let everything else go hang. The last country that did this, you might want to recall, was the old Soviet Union, where their military was in, decent shape and they couldn't even give their people toilet paper. We are not that. We are obviously much better than that. But it sort of gives you an idea of how this happens and how you think about the fact, what is defense? How do you protect yourself? What's important to people? And as the government coalesces, more and more money seems to go to the military.
Well, absolutely. And by the way, just as one statistic, there's a new study now showing that that we've been undercounting the number of opioid-related deaths in this country because we have not, for example, included disease, vectors that come in as a result of drug use and so on. So, many multiples of the number of people that died on 9/11, as tragic as that was. So, some deaths seem to weigh more than others if they become a trigger for defense spending. And not coincidentally, defense stocks have been doing very well since the killing of Qasem Soleimani. I haven't looked in the last several days, but immediately afterwards they did extremely well. So I guess it's a kind of pathology, right?
I think so. I think it's almost like I think all of these things are almost like societal tics on some level. And I think the thing that is most distressing about it is we so take it for granted that people don't actually question it that much. It just is part of the air we breathe or the water we drink or whatever analogy you want to use. That of course we're going to spend all this money on the military. And of course we then don't have enough money to give people decent health care. And that's, by the way, another great example here is somehow we don't have enough money to give people decent health care, but we do have enough money to give, multitudes of the amount of spending to the medical industrial complex that any other country does.
Yeah, no, I think that's absolutely right. And my understanding is you have to leave us shortly. So in conclusion, and I'll give you the last word, but I think the through line here between Social Security and medical care and the military is that for all of this so-called hard thinking, tough thinking that the Alan Simpsons of the world claim they do, we're really not looking at the financing of our government in a clear-eyed way. Our priorities are completely skewed, and our political debate needs to be upgraded to reflect that. But I'll give you the last word if you want.
I think that's as good a way to say it. I guess what I would say is we need to rethink what we think of as defense and what we need as a society, is maybe the way I would put it. And we need to think about, understand that physical health and physical well-being are also high priorities, because in the end, what else is a society supposed to do for its people? You give physical safety, you give, you give safety, you make sure people are fed, you make sure they're taken care of. I mean, these are really important things. And a society that doesn't prioritize those parts is by definition a society that's not working for many, many people. And as I said, I think we see the results all around us.
Yeah, if you're starving to death in a heavily fortified home, it's a Pyrrhic victory at best. So, Helaine Olen, opinion writer for the Washington Post, as always, great talking with you. And as always, thanks for coming on the program.
Oh, thank you for having me on.